And let me say where I come from and how I look at it. I think I'm looking at this from the point of view of saying that I believe that there is a large literature from the school of what are often called heterodox economists, who've established the point now that all countries which have made the journey from being underdeveloped to developed have passed through a phase of industrialization, which is the common objective of the African continent. And all of those that have done that by nurturing, defending, and supporting domestic industries as they begin to grow up and emerge as more competitive. As those same countries become more competitive, they very often then adopt a much more free trade stance because they are now competitive. Indeed, to the point often of trying to deny others that follow them access to the very same policy tools that they themselves use to get where they are. That phenomenon started being described by the 19th century German economist Friedrich List as kicking away the ladder. And I think that another important lesson of economic history is that those who had the courage to say thanks but no thanks when they received that advice were actually the ones that made very significant headway. So I'm struck by the example that I recall reading about at the end of the 19th century, the end of the Civil War, when the United States was starting to industrialize. Britain was much more industrialized already. Britain was coming along and preaching free trade to the United States. And a congressman famously said, "We'll do what Britain did, not what Britain says." And I think that's a kind of a catchphrase that I often bear in mind. Now, where have we been? I think we all know where we've been. We've been through, since the early 1990s, and the establishment of the World Trade Organization following the Uruguay Round. We've had a model of international trade governance which I have chosen to characterize as hegemonic multilateralism. It's multilateral in the sense that all of us participate, and that's good. All of us have a right to participate. But hegemonic in the sense, to use George Orwell's famous phrase, that some of us who participate there are more equal than others. That the power relations in the global economy are definitely reflected in the outcomes. And along with, I think, some very profound changes in technology, in production, and in the real organization of trade, as you all know, the World Trade System following the Uruguay Round has institutionalized the deepest and most profound trade liberalization across the world. And along with that, there's been a compression of the differentiation between industrializers and the industrialized that I talked about, which I think is essential for development. The rhetoric that was developed was saying that trade liberalization is as good for the weak as it is for the strong, and that all of this should be embraced in the interests of overall growth and development. Now, I do acknowledge, of course, that there has been beneficiaries from the system in the developing world. I think the obvious and most significant one of those is China, which was able to take advantage of the greater trade openings in the developed world for its products. But I think at the same time we need to notice that China, at the same time and simultaneously as it was moving up the ladder, followed decidedly non-orthodox industrial policies. So it has been the latest. That's the system that we've had in place. But now, as I said at the beginning, and as I think we were talking about, there's been a massive tsunami against that, driven by a populism that's emerged in the developed world. And this populism, I think, is speaking to people in the so-called middle class, which I think also includes parts of the working class, who feel that the system has failed them, they've been left out, they're not benefiting from the prosperity that the system is creating. And that I think there's a body of research which will tell us that this is not totally unfounded. I saw something which the IMF produced a little while ago, which was basically saying that in the period from the late 70s to the middle 90s, people in this category called the middle class in the United States would have expected the next generation to be better off than the current generation. But from the mid-90s onwards, it's been the opposite for people in that category. Many of the people in that category, the next succeeding generation, their lives are less secure economically, and they have not been increasing their incomes. And there's been a bit of a discussion that takes place among trade ministers who sometimes participate in these things, who have acknowledged that this is a reality, that what we've had is growth, but in the absence of inclusivity, a lack of inclusive growth. That's what's been happening. And it's affected strata like that in the developed world. And that then you get a little bit of a rearguard action. Some people try to say, well, it's not the free trade, it's the fourth industrial revolution. It's the introduction of digitization, robotics, 3D printing, artificial intelligence. It's this that's wiping out the jobs. But I think that the harsh reality is it's the both together, and the system as a whole is generating increasing inequality. You all know that every year at the time of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Oxfam does the calculation of how many people is it that have as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population, and the numbers keep shrinking every year. They've gone from triple digits to double digits now, and I think that's the harsh reality, that's the world as it is. Now, I don't think the backlash is limited to the developed world. In the developed world, it's a sort of a vision that things were better in the past. It's a looking backwards kind of populism. But there's many other populisms, I think, that we've seen in the developing world as well. Many other discontents from this system that we've seen. And I think that if we were to look at this in the abstract, we would probably have to say that this is, I think, what our view, our position is, and the way we've tried to argue things in multilateral fora. This ought to be a moment when there is a push towards a more inclusive multilateralism, a multilateralism of solidarity, a multilateralism in which it's not the biggest ones who are more equal than the rest of us, but in which we actually do work together for the common good, and to ensure that the weaker and poorer among us are the ones that benefit the most. That ought to be where we're moving. But I think it's pretty evident that that's not the political force that's likely to shape the immediate future. So I think that what the risk is that we're moving from an era of hegemonic multilateralism to a period of outright mercantilism, when it's I want what I want, you can take a jump, and I will just use my power to insist on getting my own way. And I think that there are some features and phenomena that we're all going to have to grapple with. I've been looking at a paper from the South Centre on this new proposal, which is now doing the rounds and looks like a serious proposition of the border adjustment tax. And I think the border adjustment tax will make a massive difference to all kinds of developing countries' trade performance and profile with the United States. I don't know if you've gone through the border adjustment tax, but as I understand it, roughly speaking, what's going to happen is corporate tax is going to be reduced, and at the same time the inputs which are from the United States will be deductible, but inputs coming from the developing or coming from outside the United States will not be. They will be subject to the corporate tax. So what will happen is that everybody from retailers to manufacturers and everybody else who's using imported components or is selling imported products will have a serious tax disadvantage compared to those who are not. That, I think, is what's on the cards. Probably a long and detailed debate as to whether this is in violation of the WTO. Probably a long response time, if anybody indeed has the courage to take up this issue at the WTO. And then the big question remains, if there were hypothetically to be a ruling against this in the WTO, would it be respected? I think this is the world we're coming into. It's going to make a massive difference to the prospects of exports from the whole world, including the developing world, into the United States. The trade paper, which they released a few weeks ago, is telling us that they think there's unfairness and that what we need to do is to move towards fair trade. Now, this is not what Oxfam means by fair trade, nor is it what we've been talking about in the WTO for many years. Fair trade means that you must take our products and you must not put your products into our market if they disadvantage our local produce. That's a simple story. That's where I think it's going. And I think we better smell the coffee, understand what this is about, and let me turn to what I think this is about. So we want to industrialize. So we want to move up the value chain. Very good reasons why we want to do that. Because increasingly, the value in value chains constituted by countries that produce raw materials, be they agricultural raw materials or mineral raw materials, is a small and diminishing proportion of the total value of the product. Even basic manufacturing is not the biggest part anymore. It's the branding and all of that kind of thing. But with manufacturing, you're higher up than you would have been. So we want to industrialize. Now, I said already, China developed during the era of trade liberalization, globalization. It actually managed to significantly advance by exporting manufactured goods into the developed world, including the United States. I think that they have realized, even before the election of the Trump administration, that this is not a model that's going to continue without limit into the future. So they have been making a change. They are already turning to their domestic economy, increasing consumption, trying to move up into the areas of innovation, stuff like that. That's where their transformation is trying to take them as a Chinese economy. India, which is doing relatively well now, has a large domestic market that it can fall back on. Now, I think that what we have, and the misfortune we have as Africa, is that colonialism divided us into 54 different countries. And even the biggest of us doesn't have the kind of size of a market, either measured by GDP or by population, that's going to sustain and support deep industrialization. Now, here's the opportunity that we have. The opportunity we have is that we can do this if we, in fact, enlarge the size of our markets and we follow programs and policies that are going to support deep industrialization. So I think that the journey that we've been on, and it's a correct journey, I don't think it's been theorized quite as often as perhaps it should be. But it is to say that the current phase of regional integration on the African continent ought to be characterized by broadening integration beyond our existing regional communities rather than trying to deepen integration within them. So in SADC, we had a big, long debate about whether we should have a SADC customs union, whether we should actually, let's just remind ourselves that the RISDP that was, it's now in the on the shelves gathering dust, that one told us we were supposed to have a monetary union by 2016. Now, I think that actually if we look at that, None of that would have made any benefit for any of us, really, if we had a customs union with a common external tariff and we had a monetary union. If we had a monetary union, I don't know who's going to play the role of Germany in bailing out everybody else. There's certainly nobody around us, not us. So we didn't go there. Instead, we've said that it's broadening integration, moving into free trade areas beyond our communities, but also realizing that free trade areas, establishment of free trade areas is not enough. The trade dimension is not enough in its own right. Because if you look at our rather modest levels of intra-regional trade, I believe it's about 12% of the total trade. One of the barriers that we have, of course, is that if you are a producer and exporter of one primary mineral commodity, you're Zambia, you produce copper, and the next door country produces also some copper, but maybe some iron ore, you don't have a huge amount to trade with each other. And that's the problem. I think the good news is actually that the second, after your place in the global economy like that, the second thing is that you have is that your next item probably is trade with each other. But that trade with each other is characterized by inadequate and weak infrastructure. So we're having a nice debate here in South Africa about colonialism. Did colonialism build us the roads and everything? Must be, yeah. And I think that many of us would say, and in fact I'm building on, there was an excellent input I saw in the Oxford Union. There was a little tweet doing the rounds, an Indian MP who was saying, colonialism built the roads and the railways to take the products from India to the market, to the port and out of the country. That's what it did. It wasn't there to benefit the development of the country. Likewise, the continent. The roads, the railways that we have, by and large, are to take something from some raw material from inland out to the port and are gone. Not, in fact, to connect us up one to the other. So we've got a problem. We're not producing. We're not diversified. We're not complementary. And the second one is that we don't have the infrastructure in place. And so out of this, the thesis we've developed is that we need not just trade integration, but developmental integration. We need to address those three things together in programs and projects. So it is, we build a free trade area, but even if we have a free trade area, it's not going to promote the growth of regional value chains unless we simultaneously have an infrastructure build program and also cooperation to develop regional value chains. So that's where it really comes in, regional value chains. Regional value chains where the final product may be made in one or other country, but it includes inputs from several of the countries that are in that particular value chain. That's what I think is what we desperately need to bring about. We desperately need to be moving towards that. Now, that also requires that we adopt a much more strategic approach to how we embrace trade relations with the rest of the world. Because, you know, if we were to take many of the trade negotiations that are possibly on the cards multilaterally, or things we get asked to engage in with country X, country Y, or region X or region Y, very often we're talking about trade in NAMA, non-agricultural market access, industrial products. Trade between countries that have got a real capability and ourselves which don't yet have it. And what will be offered to us is a level of access into their markets, probably distant, probably different to penetrate, and probably we don't have the productive base to be able to take up those advantages. But damn it, if we give them the same, they'll be able to come here with finished products, which will mean that our ability to develop regional value chains will be probably curtailed by the influx of finished products. I think those are the challenges that confront us. And so, as South Africa, we've been basically very committed to this journey that we're on, starting with the tripartite and moving to the eventual destination of the continental free trade area. What we need to do, I think, is to be moving from the frameworks and the general agreements into actually very much more of the substantive, commercially meaningful negotiations. And I'm actually pleased to say that in the tripartite, we're beginning to get there. We're almost at the finishing line between SACU and the East African community. We're on the journey with Egypt. Now, I think my team is telling me that we can finish the SACU East African community before the half year, and certainly before the end of the year. Now, if we do that, I think that will be a substantial indication that we've begun to enlarge real commercially meaningful opportunities in a significant part of the continent. And I think it's very important that we do that. So because I think the British and the EU are starting to realize this, that I've been around the block for a while and I've never come across any trade negotiation that takes as long as it says at the beginning. And certainly I've never come across one that's got any level of complexity in it that takes 2 years. So I think they all know that they're in for a shocker. But ours has taken longer, that's the point I wanted to make, than our heads of state told us it should. But I think that we are beginning to make some progress, and I do believe that we need to actually redouble and dedicate our efforts to ensuring that we actually move on those. So let me just say that's our priority as South Africa, regional integration and particularly broadening integration, particularly promoting developmental integration. We've begun to tool up, I think, for a new era. We have a division in the DTI called Trade and Invest Africa. And we know as South Africa that a very significant part of our manufactured exports goes to the rest of the African continent. And we need to continue to make sure that we are players in this space, particularly where there are products coming from elsewhere into the continent. But I think we also know at the same time that as the rest of the continent industrializes, we support that it should. It's not going to be that we're just going to be able to pump finished products into all of their markets. We've got to start moving into the space of regional value chains, where there's much more trading components, where there's much more trade driven by investment, where there's much more trade driven by addressing the infrastructure and the consequent things that follow therefrom. And so what we're beginning to do now is to change the shape of our trade missions. So I was just talking to our team this morning, actually. They've just been to Zambia, talking about energy. And energy in Zambia, how do we partner with Zambian companies? We bring in our own. How do we develop a package so that there's a preference for us working together as African countries to solve common challenges of infrastructure? And through that, there's trade, probably in intermediate products, and there's much more development in a kind of collegial way, cooperative way of infrastructure projects. That's something I think that we need to start preparing for. Let me just say a couple of things about our remaining extra regional trade issues. Let me say about Brexit, just very quickly, just to all kinds of discussions about what Brexit will mean for the world and for South Africa and so on. I think the good news is that we had a discussion in SACU on Friday in the council, and we've been having a lot of discussions ourselves with the British. And I think that we are able, and the British want to do this as well, we are able to avoid any interruption in our trade with the UK as a result of Brexit, and that must be our first prize, and we must go for it. And this arises from the fact that we have as SACU and the SADC-EPA group, which also includes Mozambique. Angola is part of the group but didn't sign. We have the Economic Partnership Agreement, which replaced the Trade Development Cooperation Agreement. We have that in place already. And we've said to the British that, well, this ought to be the template. Let's just build on this as the template. And they seem to be willing to do that. They've got other ambitions. We said, well, let's put that in the future. But right now, let's focus on making sure we don't have any interruption. And that does seem to be something that should be straightforward and quite easy. For every other member of SACU, all we really need to agree on is that we just just change the name. It's Britain and us and whatever. Because the EPA provides duty-free, quota-free access into the EU for every product that the rest of the SACU countries export. For us, we didn't get that. We have a number of tariff rate quotas, particularly on agricultural products. So what we've got to do is have a negotiation with the British about those. What tariff rate quota were they going to give us on wine, for example? And when 40% of our wine goes to the UK, 40% of the wine sent to the EU goes to the UK, it's not just 1/28th of the existing quota. So that's what we've been saying. Let's have a negotiation around the tariff rate quotas and see where that takes us. And let's start it fairly soon. So we agreed, let's get our letter in to the Brits quickly and say to them, we want to start this process as SACU, and let's get this thing done well before the 2 years is up and the British exit. As far as the rest of the EU is concerned, to see how they respond to this, but I've been saying we don't need to have a discussion with you. We've got tariff rate quotas. You didn't give us any additional quota when Croatia joined, so we don't think you should give us a lesser quota because somebody leaves. So we don't think we need a negotiation with you, but we'll have to see how they respond to that. That's our position on that. On the WTO, as you probably all know, we've had the Doha Round has been in the doldrums for many, many years. And I think my view of why it was in the doldrums is that too little was offered in the main development significant areas in agriculture. It was a rather modest package. And too much was asked in return in areas where the developed world was competitive, NAMA, services and other things. And that imbalance in one shape or form meant that there was no progress in the Doha. But the Doha 2001 was a very important moment because it entrenched a principle which I wish we could say that when we win a declaratory statement it gets carried through, but unfortunately it doesn't. But it said the needs and interests of developing countries must be at the heart of the work program. It does speak to the kind of multilateralism I was saying we don't really have. Because I think that what happens is too often the developing world, we win the battle of the title or we win the battle of the declaration, and then we lose the battle over the actual tariff schedules that come into play. I think that's too often what happens. But that principle is extremely important. I think as you all know, we went to Nairobi in 2015, and for the first time ever, we're getting these ritual things that everyone signed on to now falling off the table. And that one was everyone committed themselves to a conclusion of the Doha Round. We didn't get that. A number of the majors refused to agree to anything like that. And they were indicating and signaling that what they wanted was what they called a 21st century trade agreement. I think the template for that was something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but more particularly they were looking at issues like electronic commerce and things like that. And so we sort of agreed on a compromise that many of us think the Doha remains valid, many of the issues need to be picked up, but at the same time, we will have exploratory discussions on some of the other matters without prejudice and so on and so forth. That's where we've been at the end of Nairobi. Now, what we've been having up to now is, I think, signals that anything from the Doha basket, and in particular anything on agriculture, looks extremely unlikely to find its way into an agreement coming out of the Buenos Aires meeting, which is taking place at the end of this year. For the reason that probably the last issue that could have come out in a relatively consensual way on domestic support came out in Nairobi. On export competition rather. When we come on to domestic support, I think all the issues are linked one to another, and people don't want to give ground until there's market access, and this one won't give until that gives. I think that it looks extremely unlikely that anything will emerge there. There was pressure for something on e-commerce. And what was what the pressure there is for us to agree in Buenos Aires that we should start negotiations on electronic commerce. Now, I think that we need to look very carefully at these kind of subjects before we rush in to agreeing to things like that. And I think there's no doubt that electronic commerce, e-commerce, is becoming the shape of the future. There's no doubt that if we're smart about it in the developing world, we can use some of the tools of e-commerce innovatively, and we can solve some of our own developmental problems and things like that. But there's a world of difference between saying that these technologies are coming and we need to be part of it and we need to use it and have a developmental approach to it and start talking about trade rules and the multilateral trading system. Because what the trade rules that would come out would do is they would prevent us from putting any kind of tariff or regulation on e-commerce transactions, which is the interim arrangement that's in force now. Now, when we start talking about this, I think we have to have an eye to the future and not just to the present. Because at the moment, e-commerce transactions that take place fully across internet platforms would probably be confined to books, to music, and to DVDs, probably that, or films, let's say, entertainment. But with the onset of the fourth industrial revolution, one of the things that is likely to emerge is what's called the Internet of Things, where one machine linked up to the internet links up and directs another machine in another place, and that 3D printers come in. So the South Centre has given an example, and they say that what could happen is that the software around the design of shoes is transferred to a 3D printer, and that, lo and behold, we now have, through electronic commerce platforms, free trading shoes. Is that what we want? The other thing, of course, we need to take note is that I think it's 5 countries at the moment that dominate 80% of cross-border e-commerce. Now, I think that what that says to me is, let's put our thinking caps on. Let's think what we really want. Let's not get rushed into agreeing to something because something's important. Suddenly it must rush into a WTO, a trade rule. It's something that needs a lot of multilateral attention, I'm sure, but probably multilateral attention are in the International Postal Union and bodies like that. What is the developmental framework and package that comes in? So I think that on this one, and a number of countries have made a similar point to the one I've been making now, I'm not too sure that much is going to be agreed on that either. And then we don't know what is going to be the intervention of the newcomers. I made a little comment myself when we were in Davos at the informal WTO at the beginning of the year. I was right at Inauguration Day, and I said there's an elephant that's not in the room. Everything that's been said here is subject to the entry of the elephant. And I think that's actually where we are. We don't know what they're going to do, but we do know that they don't place much store on multilateralism. They prefer bilateralism. And I think that our own view, and actually South Africa, we're now the chair of the General Council. Ambassador Xavier Karim is the chair of the General Council. So I talk to him from time to time, what's happening, any progress? Doesn't look like very much. We may have to prepare ourselves for the biggest outcome and biggest success that we might get out of Buenos Aires is the reaffirmation of the significance of multilateralism. But I think that if we do that, we also need to be putting on the table that we really need to look at and look critically at multilateralism. Why is multilateralism under threat at the moment, and how do we make a multilateralism that contributes much more to inclusive growth? So I've given you a little bit of around the houses. Let me stop there. I don't know if you want to take questions, but I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.